Anna Kasparian, who's a longtime progressive activist, I think you would call her, journalist, analyst. She's the co-host of The Young Turks, which has become one of the largest progressive independent news outlets. She's been the longtime co-host of Cenk Uygur, has often talked about how she was somebody who for a long time believed that anyone who voted differently than she did, especially people who voted for conservatives or Republicans, or people who she was conditioned to automatically view as being evil. Not as people who were voting wrong or had misguided views or maybe just different experiences as she, but people who were actually evil with whom you should have no interaction. And she appeared on a podcast called Modern Wisdom just a couple of weeks ago. And, you know, I think she's approaching middle age. For me, it's a little bit of a late time to have this realization, but a lot of people never have it. So better late than never, credit to her. And here is what she said in describing how she finally abandoned this perspective, this mindset that our media and our political system is so often encouraging us to adopt about one another.
And so I'm like trying to get his bicycle like up the stairs. And all of a sudden this man stops me. His name's Jeff. And he's like, hey, let me help you out with that. And he starts helping me out. He stopped everything he was doing to help me out. And then Jeff and I became very close. You know, one of my neighbors who I really like, he was my favorite person in the entire building. And years go by. One day we're in an HOA meeting, homeowners association, and one of the people living in the building said something about Trump that was negative. I don't remember what it is. And Jeff whispers in my ear, oh, she's going to start trashing Trump. I'm out of here. And it hit me that he's a Trump supporter. We had never talked about politics before. And I'm like, so I got to know Jeff before I knew what his politics were. Incredibly kind guy. He helps everyone in this building with anything they might need. And so that woke me up to, wait a minute, not all Trump supporters are like dangerous, evil individuals. And yes, it was stupid that I thought that to begin with. Like, I'm embarrassed admitting that, but it's just how I believed. And that kind of was one of the moments where it's like a light bulb went off and something was telling me, you need to scratch beneath the surface a little more because you don't have a realistic view of what's going on here.
So just to correct something I said, I mean, I said she said this recently on a podcast, which she did, but I also said seems kind of late in life to have that realization. Turns out from the story, it's at least been years ago, so I don't know when she had this experience, but I think for people who are deeply enmeshed in partisan or ideologically rigid media like her, to explain a story like that as kind of simple as it may seem, and maybe the simplicity of it makes it a little more attractive, I think those things are important. I think that's an important way of countering all of this other poisonous messaging that we've been hearing. So I just want to share my own experience in this regard. I've actually thought about this a lot, especially as I've been reading this sort of amazingly toxic instructions to people about how to deal with others who have different views than you. I think I talked about this once before on our after show with locals, but just want to share my own story about this before we get to the next segment. So, you know, I grew up in pretty classically liberal enclaves. I grew up in South Florida when I was growing up, and my grandparents were my biggest political influence, and they were Jews from the Depression, and they worshipped FDR, and they were always very liberal Democrats. I remember the first election just very vaguely when Richard Nixon ran against George McGovern, and they were super committed to electing George McGovern, and that was the kind of environment in which I was raised. It's Broward County, which is just north of Miami-Dade, which has always been a heavily Democratic county. It's the place that elects people like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. And I grew up my whole childhood just assuming the Democratic Party was better, and also in the 1980s is really when I came of political age. I turned 13 in 1980. That was the era of Ronald Reagan. And that Reagan movement was driven in large part by a very hardcore socially conservative, religiously evangelical movement. People like Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. And as somebody who, as a teenager, started realizing that I was gay and identifying that and trying to grapple with what that was like, the only messaging I was getting from the media about that was it was immediately associated not just with a spiritual or symbolic disease, but with an actually horrific disease. It was AIDS and then HIV, where the only images you would see of people who were gay were people who were wasting away from this absolutely terrifying disease. Nurses and doctors didn't even want to go in the room. They didn't know what it was. And there was a lot of really ugly rhetoric about what this disease was. It was God's retribution. So for me, I always took on religious conservatism in particular, but conservatism in general as this sort of cruel ideology that was mostly for rich people and didn't care about poor people or the working class. And then the social aspect of it was just kind of this very judgmental, exclusionary, almost violently aggressive posture toward people that they judged as immoral, which included me. And so I had a lot of hostility toward it, just kind of unthinking hostility that anybody who subscribed to that ideology was essentially a bad person. I mean, this is my teens and my late teens, where you don't have a lot of instruments to critically evaluate what you think. I then went to college in Washington, D.C., where there was a lot of that similar view. Obviously, D.C. is a very liberal enclave. And then when I went to law school in New York City, and I went to NYU, which is a very kind of liberal left law school as well, in my second year of law school, I was, you originally live in a dorm, but then in your second year, you move off campus to an apartment. And my roommate was this woman who was a good friend of mine. And it turned out that she started dating this guy that she really liked and got serious enough that he invited her home to his house, his parents' house in Massachusetts. And she went there and visited. And then she came back after the weekend and said, "Oh my God, you're not going to believe it. His parents are incredibly right-wing. They're fanatical Rush Limbaugh supporters. And his mother in particular is an extremist." And this was right at the beginning of the internet, where the internet was kind of segregated by AOL and it was CompuServe, and they all had these little forums isolated within these closed communities. And she said there's this forum that Rush Limbaugh listeners use. It is run by the National Review and the Heritage Foundation. It's full of not just conservatives, but like hardcore evangelicals, housewives who are super socially conservative. They're very anti-gay, anti-abortion, everything. You should go in there and kind of just troll them, like go in there and just make them all miserable, disrupt, and everything was anonymous on the internet then. And so I was like, oh, that sounds so much fun. And I started to do that. And I went in with the intention to just sort of provoke anger and to kind of provoke debates where I could attack them, be very aggressive. And that's what I started doing. And then over time, the debates got a little bit more sincere. And instead of just trying to be provocative, I was actually engaging with people and trying to kind of almost convince them, as they were trying to convince me, of the very different views that we had. And then after a little bit of more time, a few weeks, a couple months, I started to get to know people a little bit who were in these forums. We would DM each other. I kind of became a regular on this platform. And, you know, they were as foreign to me, being these like people in the middle of the country who were evangelical, who loved Ronald Reagan, who were against everything having to do with gay rights, who were super right-wing, loved the moral majority, as I was to them. I was this gay, Jewish lawyer in the middle of Manhattan, because by that point I was already working at a law firm. And yet, eventually those differences kind of started eroding, because we were having this increasingly intimate sort of interaction of the kind that you ultimately have with people when you deal with them a lot online. And I remember after about 8 or 9 months, they told me that this forum every year has a get-together where everybody in the forum goes to one place in the United States and just spends the weekend together so they can actually meet in person. And the event, they said, was going to be held in some faraway suburb of Indianapolis, some place in like a hotel in the middle of Indiana. And I remember thinking, like, I think I want to go to this. I kind of want to see who these people are. I've been talking to them now for 8 months. And I remember telling my friends in law school, oh, I think I'm going to go here. And they had this character of what social conservatives and religious conservatives and people who are hardcore right-wingers were. And they were saying, are you crazy? You can't go to the middle of Indiana and meet with these people. They're going to kill you. They're going to murder you. This is like a trap. And I kind of knew them. I didn't really believe that. But, you know, I had a little bit of trepidation. Anyway, long story short, I went there. I got to hang out with them the entire weekend. We had, you know, various lunches and dinners and events. And all of these people who my whole life I had been trained to view as hateful, as filled with malice, who were very judgmental, could not have been warmer or more compassionate or just more welcoming to me entering their world. And obviously that made me feel the same way to them. And it was one of the most interesting weekends I've ever had, spending 3 days with people who up until that point I had no connection with or involvement with. And it obviously left me, once I left, realizing that I had had these caricatures of people who had been placed, these characters that were placed into my brain by ideological enclaves and political sectors and just societal divisions that had no bearing on who these people were. They were completely the opposite of what I had always thought they were like. And I have a strong sense, and in fact I've talked to some of them afterwards, that they had views of the kind of person I was that also got disabused simply through interaction, communion, conversation. And for me, I think I was 22, 23 at the time. It really transformed how I think about other people. I try to be very conscious of the assumptions that you make. And this is one of the reasons I think I'm so offended by this narrative about cutting off ties with your family members because you assume everybody who votes for Trump is hateful and racist and wants to see you in a concentration camp. Anybody who has had any conscious experience where you've critically evaluated the things that you grew up being taught to believe, any ability to empathize with others, a curiosity about why other people think differently, which is usually a byproduct of their own kind of arbitrary upbringing about religion and society and the communities in which they were raised versus the ones in which you were raised. But at the same time, these human attributes don't really depend upon political ideology. You have terrible people in all camps. You have great people in all camps. And I never really thought that was such a profound realization for me before. It was something that when I had it, obviously transformed how I think. But ever since then, it just seems so obvious to me. And yet to see this very rigid, political, hate-driven discourse that is encouraging people to cut off ties with family members and end their marriages over these kinds of differences based on this childlike view that people who see politics differently than you do must be of evil character is something that to me is something that people very early on in life overcome. And yet, as it turns out, at least a lot of people who are paid to write about politics and who work in political media are people who have no conception that this is true. They're very insulated. They lack empathy. And if anybody deserves to have social relations cut off, it's these people and not the ones that are encouraging others to scorn and avoid. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.